Rob's Best Recipes, Maple Squares. Today I'm going to make maple squares. I've made them ever since I was a kid. After I watched my mother make them, after I tasted hers, I thought I got to learn how to do that because they're just scrumptious. So I've made them for the last over 55 years. Anyway, so I have a cookbook with recipes in it and loose papers. I also have a list of my favorite recipes on the computer, and I usually make a video of some of my favorite recipes of all time, and I have a YouTube channel called Rob's Best Recipes. But today I decided I should make maple squares, and I looked and I don't have a video, so I'm going to make one. So anyway, here we go. I'm looking in this book, which is a really crazy book, and there's my maple squares recipe right here, maple squares. So I'm going to make a bottom layer, and it's kind of like a shortbread crust, and then I'm going to add some jam in there on top of that, and then I'm going to put the cake layer, and then I'm going to make the icing layer. It's pretty easy, but I'll show you how I do it, and maybe you could give it a try. The first thing I do is I take my clay pot. It's about a 9 by 12 or 9 by 13. It's Pampered Chef, and you can see I've had it for a while because it's discolored, but it's clean. And the first thing I do is I butter that, okay? And then I'm going to whip up my shortbread crust and put it in there. So I get a bowl, and I threw in 2 cups of all-purpose flour. And whenever you make a cake, you should measure exactly. And I never measure exactly. So these maple squares taste pretty much the same every time I make them, but a little bit different sometimes because I don't measure, but you should measure. So 2 cups of all-purpose flour in here, and 1/3 cup of organic cane sugar, and I use a 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, and I put that in there, mix it up. There, it's mixed. And then I use 2/3 cup of room temperature butter, not unsalted, just ordinary butter, 2/3 cup, room temperature though, and 1 egg. Mix it all together, push it down in the pan. I always make sure that I check before I go along here so that I don't forget any ingredients. So I have 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 3/4 cup of butter, room temperature butter, 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, not baking soda, baking powder, 1/3 cup of cane sugar, it's organic according to my wife, and 1 egg. And I put it all in here, mix it up with my hands, and of course, my hands are pretty clean, but I'm going to bake it anyway, so kill all the germs. But there it is. It's kind of like, well, if you've ever made sugar cookies of some sort, that's what it feels like. So I'm going to take it and push it into this clay pan of mine until it's nice and flat and firm. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Nice and firm. Okay, now I'm going to take some seedless raspberry jam. And you can probably find it almost anywhere, but sometimes it's not in stock in the store I buy it at, and I have to keep going back. And when finally I get it, I buy several jars of it because I'm going to use, I'll show you the jars. These are the size, what does it say on them? First of all, it's seedless raspberry jam, and it's 250 milliliters each. They're going on top of that shortbread crust. And you don't have to use raspberry. It doesn't have to be seedless raspberry. It can be strawberry, it can be blueberry, whatever you want, but raspberry is the best. So I'll spread it on there. So I spread the jam over top of the shortbread crust. Now I'm going to make the cake part. So whenever you're making a cake, it's basically flour and sugar and butter. And a few, maybe eggs and a few other things. But this one calls for 2 cups of brown sugar. Brown sugar is almost, it's a sucrose sugar. And it's almost the same as white sugar, except it's got molasses in it to give it the color and the flavor. So if you ever substitute, if it calls for white sugar and you substitute brown, that's going to have more flavor. That's pretty much it, unless you don't like molasses. So anyway, 2 cups of brown sugar and a cup of all-purpose flour, and I'm just mixing the 2 of those together with my hands. I like working with my hands. It's kind of like being at the beach and playing in the sand, or in the garden and playing in the dirt. Anyway, and then I'm going to put in 4 eggs and a cup of butter. And the butter's going to be pretty soft. It won't be runny, but it'll be pretty soft. And so it'll be 2 cups of brown sugar, a cup of all-purpose flour, and a cup of butter, room temperature or softer, and 4 eggs. And the eggs can be large, medium, not small though. Okay, and not extra large. You don't want to have too much egg in here. And then you're going to put in some maple flavoring, whatever, a couple of dashes of that. Not too much though, but enough. Maybe a teaspoon maple flavoring. And you're going to put in maybe some walnuts. But since my wife's Aunt Nora loves this dessert, these maple squares, I don't add any nuts because she's allergic to them. Okay? And sometimes I add raisins. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I add coconut. Sometimes I don't. And I just put in as many as I want. Okay, so I'm going to make the cake and then I'm going to dump it on top of the jam. Then it's ready for the oven. So here's the stuff, here's the batter for the cake. So the cake's 2 cups of brown sugar, a cup of butter at room temperature or even more melty than that, 4 eggs. They could be at room temperature too, because sometimes if you don't have eggs at room temperature, it affects the way the cake turns out. A cup of all-purpose flour, and then I threw in a handful of raisins and some coconut and some maple flavoring, teaspoon at least of maple flavoring, and that's going to go on top of that jam, and then it's going in the oven at about 350, 340, and it'll take 45 minutes to cook. But you know how to check a cake. Shove a knife in, pull it out, it should be dry. Right down in the middle. Okay? I'll let you know how it goes. There they are, cooking away in the oven at 340 degrees for about 30, 35, 40, 45 minutes, depending on my measurements. Remember, if I don't measure quite right, it sometimes takes longer or not that long. We'll see what happens though. So when it's done, I'll put a knife in it before I take it out of the oven, and if the knife comes out dry, then it's done. But I'll watch the edges of it. That is and the shininess will go away once it starts to cook all the way through. Anyway, then I'll take it out and let it cool on the counter while I make the icing, and I'll show you what that looks like. So it took about 45 minutes at 340 degrees to cook, and I kept shoving the knife in. It went a little bit brown on me, but I think it's done. So I'll let it sit here and get cold. In the meantime, I'm going to make icing. I'm going to use icing sugar. I'm going to use a little bit of cream and some butter and some maple flavoring, and whip up some nice icing to go on top. Kind of stiff too, some stiff icing, not too runny, kind of stiff. So not so much cream, mainly butter and icing sugar. I'll show it to you when it's done. Here is the icing. So it's just maybe a couple cups of icing sugar, maybe maybe about a cup of butter at room temperature, and some maple flavoring, and maybe a half a cup of cream. But don't mix the icing sugar and the butter and even the maple flavoring first, and then it'll be kind of dry, right? And then gradually add your cream to it, and as you mix it up, it'll turn into icing that's about this texture. If it's too runny, just add more icing sugar, and if it's not runny enough, add more cream. Alrighty, I'm going to put that on that cake over there as soon as the cake's cool. This is the finished product. It looks yummy, tastes yummy, and it is yummy. Rob's Best Recipes, Maple Squares.